The wind howled like a creature possessed, swirling in frenzied patterns through the desolate landscape, a merciless force tearing at anything in its path. Snowflakes, sharp as glass, stung like daggers against the skin. The world had become an unrecognizable blur of white and gray, the storm swallowing everything it touched. No one would ever know that two young sisters, once full of laughter and light, were caught within this unrelenting fury. It's an impossible thing to comprehend, isn't it? The thought that two lives, bound by the deepest of familial ties, would choose to run towards certain death in the midst of a deadly blizzard. There must have been something far more terrifying driving them, something that outstripped the inherent fear of nature's might. It's not just a storm we need to understand. It's why, when faced with fate that seemed certain, they still pushed forward into the unknown, into the heart of the cold. Imagine the coldness creeping into your bones, the fear creeping into your heart. The wind thunders against the small, frail cabin they took refuge in, where their decision to leave everything behind had seemed simple enough when the adventure began. Two sisters, still in their youth, as innocent as the world had allowed them to be, had been on the edge of the unknown. But there's a distinction to be made between the kind of unknown you can face with excitement and the kind that fills you with dread, as if the ground under your feet might disappear entirely. They were no strangers to escape. The world they left behind was one of shadows, of whispered words and dark, of things unsaid but felt in every bone and breath. The kind of escape they sought wasn't about adventure. It wasn't about finding themselves or discovering a new world. They were running from something far deeper than the mundane troubles of any young life. It was something that had planted its roots within them, wrapping itself around their hearts, slowly choking any hope they had left. Why would they choose this storm? Why run into its heart? The question feels haunting when you consider that there have been other ways, safer paths, yet they had made this one. Did they think they could outrun it? That somehow, by fleeing into the wilderness, they could outrun the demons that stalked them every night, whispering in their ears, pressing into their minds? Their mother's voice still echoed in their heads, filled with desperation, and their father's silence, the kind that was more chilling than any angry outburst, weighed heavier on them with every passing day. Was this escape a choice, or had they simply been pushed into it, as though there was no other option left to them but to run or break? The sisters were bound not just by blood, but by an unspoken understanding. They share a unique kind of bond, one that the world might never quite understand. The world saw them as two ordinary girls, but there were things inside them that were anything but ordinary. A shared pain, a shared fear that only they truly understood. A kind of knowledge that no one else was allowed to see, a kind of dark awareness that formed between them like a secret language. And so, when the storm began to form on the horizon, they didn't hesitate. They gathered their few belongings, packed their bags, and stepped out into the tempest. To others, it would have seemed like madness, but to the sisters, there was a peculiar sense of purpose. The storm, as menacing as it was, became their refuge. For as long as they had been running, there was no real destination in mind, only the drive to escape. The mountains that loomed ahead, with their sharp edges and hidden crevices, promised them anonymity, safety, freedom from whatever had been chasing them. The blizzard, powerful and indifferent, offered them the one thing they craved: distance. Distance from the place that had been poisoning them for as long as they could remember. Perhaps it wasn't the storm itself they were running toward. Perhaps it was the very idea of it. The blizzard could destroy them, sure, but it could also give them something they'd never had, a chance to escape what had been suffocating them for years. The idea of nature, in its raw and untamable form, seemed to offer them a finality they had longed for. It wasn't just about surviving the elements. It was about surviving themselves. What could be worse than living under the constant weight of what they had left behind? The noise of their broken home still echoing in their ears, the long-suffered silences still hanging in the air, and the memories they couldn't shed. These things followed them, pressing down harder with each day that passed. To some, this might seem like an irrational act. To others, it would seem the only one left. As the wind picked up, biting at their exposed faces, they huddled together for warmth. They hadn't spoken much in the hours since the storm had worsened, and yet there was an unspoken understanding between them. They knew the journey wasn't going to be easy. They didn't need to say the words. They'd already said everything they needed to in the silent exchanges of a glance, in the shared grip of their hands as they walked through the storm. The cave was the only thing that would give them any sort of reprieve, a moment's relief from the endless onslaught of snow and ice. In the chaos of the storm, they stumbled upon it, an ice cave carved from the very mountain itself. It was small, inconspicuous, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the snow-covered slopes. But to them, it was salvation, even if only for a moment. The air inside was cold, yes, but it was a different kind of cold, the kind that gave you the illusion of protection. And so, they crawled inside, huddling together for warmth, their breaths shallow in the stillness of the cave. But even as they sought shelter, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The cold outside might have been brutal, but there was a deeper chill within them, an emotional frost that went beyond the physical. The cave, which should have felt like a sanctuary, instead felt like a prison. They had left the world behind, yet the past had followed them. No distance could erase it. The very darkness they sought to escape was still there, still lurking in their minds. The walls of the cave, frozen and unmoving, were more than just rock and ice. They were a reflection of the silence that had haunted them for years. In that moment, the storm outside raged with even greater fury, but inside the cave, the sisters sat in an eerie quiet. The crackling of the fire they had started in the center was the only sound that dared to pierce the heavy silence. And yet, in the space between each breath, the question lingered. What were they running from? They had left behind a family, a home, and yet they hadn't left behind the fear. The fear was still alive, pulsing like a hidden current under the ice, waiting for its moment to rise to the surface. The storm outside, fierce and untamable, was only a reflection of the turmoil within them. There was no peace to be found in nature. There would be no solace in the snow. And so, as they sat together, silently, shivering in the cold, the real question began to take shape. Could they ever truly escape? The days before the storm had been marked by an eerie quiet, one that hung over the sisters like a thick fog, slowly suffocating the life from them. Life, in the way it was then, had become too much, a cacophony of silence where every word spoken felt like an intrusion. The world they had known was fractured, a mirror cracked and shattered by the weight of things unsaid and actions unspoken. The house they had once called home, a place that should have been a refuge, had turned into a cold, suffocating cage. The parents, who once provided the warmth of family, had instead become distant figures, unapproachable, distant. The coldness between them was a presence in itself, a silence that stretched between the rooms, suffocating and oppressive. There had been times when the sisters had tried to make sense of their lives, of what had gone wrong, but the answers never came. They were children, after all, too young to understand the complexities of the world they were thrust into, too old to ignore the darkness that loomed. They had learned to read the unspoken, to decipher the language of silence that had become a foundation of their existence. Their mother had once been full of light, laughter, and warmth, but the woman they saw now was a ghost of that person. She had become brittle, thin, her eyes dull with exhaustion. Her silence was more oppressive than any words she could have spoken. Their father, too, had changed. The man who once held them close, who used to smile with pride when they did well in school, had turned inward. His eyes, once warm, were now cold like distant stars. He had become a shell of a person, walking around with the weight of something that none of them could understand. And that weight pressed down on them day after day. For the sisters, there had been a growing sense that there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of their home, something that lurked in the shadows, ready to pounce at any moment. Their house, once filled with love, had become a battleground, a place where the echoes of their parent frustrations reverberated through the halls, filling the rooms with thick, suffocating tension. Every corner, every hallway, had its own story, its own secret. Every glance exchanged between their parents was loaded with a meaning that only the sisters could truly grasp. They had learned early on that the words left unsaid were the most dangerous. The sisters had grown up in a world that felt like it was constantly shifting beneath their feet. They had once believed in the idea of family, of a place where they could find safety and warmth. But that belief had slowly withered away as their parents' marriage crumbled. Their mother had been the first to retreat, locking herself away in the spare bedroom, her presence a shadow of the woman she had once been. Their father, on the other hand, had become distant, retreating into his own world, his silence far louder than any argument could have been. The house had become a place of refuge for neither of them, but a prison instead, the walls closing on them, and there were days when it felt like the air itself was too thick to breathe. And yet, through all this, the sisters remained close. They had no one else. After all, their bond had grown stronger, not weaker, as the days passed. They understood each other in ways that no one else could. There was no need for words. The smallest glance, the softest touch, was enough to communicate everything. They had become each other's world, two sides of the same coin. They shared everything, their thoughts, their fears, their pain. It was in the quiet moments, when they sat side by side, that the weight of it all seemed to fall away. If only for a moment, they found comfort in each other's presence, a brief respite from the chaos that ruled their lives. But as much as they had each other, they also knew there were things they couldn't escape. The storm had been building long before they set foot in the snow. Their flight from their home was not one born purely of physical escape. No, it was much deeper than that. It was a flight from something that had settled into their bones, a weight that neither of them had ever been able to shake. They knew they couldn't outrun their past, but they could try. They could run from the unspoken truths, from the things that hovered in the background, from the relentless memories that clawed at their minds. The day they decided to leave had come quietly. There had been no grand declaration, no final confrontation. It had simply been an unspoken understanding between the two of them. The decision was made in a moment, without words, as if they had both known it had to happen, but neither of them had been brave enough to say it out loud. They had grown tired of living in a world where silence spoke louder than any argument ever could, tired of hiding, tired of pretending. Their parents had barely noticed them leaving. It was as though they had become mere shadows in their own home, moving through the rooms like ghosts. Their departure had been as quiet as the silence that had filled the house for so long. They packed their things in haste, as if time was running out, as if the world itself was telling them they had no time to waste. The storm outside had been a perfect cover. A blizzard was coming, and in that chaos, they would be lost to the world. As they made their way to the cabin in the mountains, the weight of their decision began to settle in. There was no turning back now. They didn't know exactly what they were running from, but they knew they couldn't stay. They had left behind everything. Familiar streets, the remnants of their home, their parents. They had left behind any semblance of normalcy. The cold had already begun to sink into their skin, but it wasn't the chill of the wind that unsettled them. It was the overwhelming sense that they were not just leaving a place, but something intangible, something more profound. The cabin was meant to be a temporary refuge, a place where they could get away from everything. For the first time in a long time, they were alone, just the two of them, free from the weight of their parents' eyes. They should have felt safe, but instead, they felt a strange emptiness. The walls of the cabin, though small and comforting, felt closed in. They had come to the mountains seeking peace, but all they found was a kind of haunting isolation. It was as if the very landscape itself mirrored the emptiness inside them. The snow-covered trees outside looked like silent sentinels, standing guard over their quiet misery. But what had truly driven them here? Why had they chosen the mountains, the snow, the blizzard, over familiarity of home? Had they hoped to outrun their parents' anger, their unspoken rage, or were they running from something more elusive, something that haunted the edges of their minds, something that had never truly gone away? As the wind picked up and howled around the cabin, the storm outside seemed to answer that question. It was not a storm of nature's making. It was a storm that had been brewing for years, within their family, within their very souls. The storm outside was their storm, the one they had been running from for so long. But the truth was, they couldn't escape it. As much as they tried, as much as they fled, the storm followed them. The winds howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, reminding them that the past never really goes away. The storm outside was a reflection of their emotional turmoil. It was a manifestation of everything they had tried to leave behind. But even in the face of the storm's fury, there was something else, a sense of release, however fleeting. The storm, in all its terror, offered them something they had never felt before: freedom. It was a strange and paradoxical thing, running toward danger in order to escape a life that had slowly been suffocating them. In the cold of the night, as the storm raged on, the sisters sat together in silence, their bodies close for warmth. There was no need for words now. The storm outside had consumed everything, and yet it felt as though the storm within them was far from over. The wind grew fiercer with each passing minute, a relentless force that seemed to claw at the world around them. The once silent and still mountain landscape was now alive with the fury of the storm, and in its wake, the world had become a void, swallowed by the blizzard's immense power. It was as if the mountains themselves had shifted, their peaks obscured by swirling white, casting shadows over the path the sisters had taken. The cabin, which had once seemed like a haven, was now nothing more than a temporary stop, a mere shelter in the face of nature's wrath. They had believed it would provide them refuge, but the storm had shattered any illusion of safety, leaving them with nothing but the bitter realization that the world outside was indifferent to their presence. They had ventured into the wilderness not to seek solace, but to escape, to run from the invisible way of the past, the haunting suffocation of their lives. The storm was no longer just a physical force. It had become an embodiment of the internal chaos they had tried to outrun. As the wind howled around the cabin, they could hear it, the eerie echo of their own internal struggles, amplifying the storm's intensity. Every gust that battered the walls seemed to mirror the conflict inside them, the tension, the fear, the uncertainty that had plagued them for years. The moment they had stepped out into the storm, they had done so with a sense of urgency, as if the world would collapse in on them if they didn't act quickly. The snow, falling in heavy sheets, stung their faces, making their eyes water, forcing them to squint against its relentless assault. It was as though the storm was trying to erase them, to strip them of any identity they had left. The biting cold gnawed at their bones, a reminder that they were at the mercy of the elements, with nothing but the bond between them to keep them going. Their footsteps were swallowed by the snow almost immediately, leaving no trace behind as if they had never existed at all. The path ahead was invisible, swallowed by the blinding white, a vision of nothingness that stretched out endlessly before them. There was no guide, no direction, only the instinct to keep moving forward, to push deeper into the heart of the storm, to outrun whatever it was that had driven them to this point. Every step was a battle, a fight against a force that seemed determined to bury them. The snow grew deeper, thicker with every moment, weighing them down as they trudged forward, pushing through the cold and the confusion. It was as if the storm itself was trying to slow them, to make them stop, but they refused to yield. They had to keep going. They had to find something, some way out of this nightmare they had found themselves trapped in. The world outside had become an alien landscape, and their only choice was to surrender to the storm, to allow it to carry them forward into the unknown. The cabin, now miles behind them, had been a brief respite, a temporary escape from the storm's unrelenting power. But as they moved forward, the reality of their situation began to settle in. They had no plan, no sense of where they were going, only the drive to keep moving, to outrun the fear that had followed them into this frozen wasteland. The deeper they ventured into the snow, the more they realized just how ill-prepared they were. They had thought they could simply find shelter and wait out the storm, but nature was unforgiving. The cold was beyond anything they had ever experienced. Their fingers, numb from the biting chill, could barely grasp onto the few things they had brought with them. Their breath came out in shallow, visible puffs, and the sound of their feet crunching in the snow was the only thing they could hear over the howling wind. The landscape around them was indistinguishable, the snow creating an endless white void. It felt as though they were trapped in a dream, one that twisted and turned with every step they took. There was no sense of time, no way of knowing how long they had been walking, how long they had been lost. The storm had taken control of everything, leaving them helpless to its will. They had not spoken for hours, the silence between them heavy, suffocating. The unspoken weight of their decision to leave everything behind hung between them, a constant reminder that they were alone in this, bound together by the shared understanding that their lives had become too much to bear. The storm, as violent and chaotic as it was, mirrored their inner turmoil, their fears, and their uncertainty. It was as though the blizzard was pushing them towards some inevitable reckoning, one they could not escape, no matter how far they ran. The cold had begun to seep into their very souls. Every step forward felt heavier, more burdensome, as if the snow had become a physical manifestation of the weight of their past. It was suffocating them, pulling them down, threatening to swallow them whole. They were not just battling the elements anymore. They were battling their own fears, the things they had left behind, the darkness they had tried to escape but could never outrun. And then, amidst the chaos of the storm, they saw it, a faint outline in the distance, something that didn't belong. It was a cave, hid within the snow, carved into the very mountainside. At first, it appeared like nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the light or the snow, but as they drew closer, it became undeniable. It was a cave, a small, sheltered space in the heart of the mountain, offering them the refuge they had desperately sought. They stumbled toward it, barely able to make out the entrance through the thickening snowfall. The wind howled, roaring in their ears, but the promise of shelter, even temporary, felt like a salvation. They pushed themselves forward, their legs aching, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The storm, though still fierce, had taken on a different meaning now. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was a constant companion, an unrelenting presence that refused to be ignored. But this cave, it was something else. It offered them a reprieve, a momentary escape from the storm's fury. When they finally reached the cave's entrance, they collapsed, their bodies spent, their minds numb from the hours of walking. They were safe for the moment. The cold outside, the wind, the snow, it all seemed to fall away as they stepped inside, into the dimly lit space that would become their refuge tonight. But as they sank to the ground, the relief they had hoped for did not come. The cave, though warm in comparison to the outside, was cold in its own way. It was too still, too quiet. There was something unsettling about it. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and stone. The walls seemed oppressing on them, the shadows creeping around the edges of their vision, and for a brief moment, they wondered if they had made the right choice. Had they truly escaped the storm, or had they simply walked into another trap, another place where the past had catch up to them? They sat in silence for what felt like hours, their minds swirling with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its fury a distant but ever-present reminder that they were not safe. The snow piled up around the cave's entrance, cutting them off from the world. They were alone, cut off from everything they had known. But it was more than just the storm outside that threatened them. It was a storm within. The cave, which had seemed like a sanctuary moment before, now felt like a tomb, a place where the weight of their decisions hung over them. As they sat there, in the dim light of the cave, the silence became unbearable. They were no longer running from the storm. They were running from each other, from everything they had left behind, from everything they couldn't face. The wind continued to howl, but inside the cave, there was only stillness. The sisters sat together, their bodies close for warmth, but the distance between them had never felt greater. The storm outside was fierce, but was nothing compared to the storm raging inside. And so they waited, not knowing what would come next, but knowing that no matter what, they could not outrun the fear, the pain, the darkness that had followed them here. The ice cave, though small and unassuming from the outside, was a stark contrast to the blinding fury of the storm outside. As the sisters huddled within its cool, shadowed depths, a temporary calm washed over them, its stillness a stark reminder how far they had come. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, the coldness of the cave wrapping around them like a blanket, but it was a blanket that offered only minimal comfort. The heat of their bodies, though fleeting, was enough to stave off the worst of the cold for the moment. For now, they were sheltered from the relentless snow and biting winds, but inside, the echoes of their choices lingered. They were alone now, in every sense of the word. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable, and the vastness of the storm, though present in their minds, was no longer immediately threatening. Instead, the cavernous walls of the ice cave seemed to press in around them, tightening their sense of isolation. In the dark, their thoughts, heavy with doubt and unspoken fears, began to stir once again, pushing them toward a reckoning they had not yet been willing to face. At first, there was only silence. The cave was an ancient, forgotten place, a natural formation of frozen stone and jagged icicles hanging from the ceiling like the teeth of some great, silent beast. The faint glow of their torchlight flickered against the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach, adding to the surreal atmosphere. In that dim light, the sisters looked at one another, their eyes searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps answers. But the silence between them grew only thicker, heavier, as though the very air inside the cave had become thick with unspoken truths. It was as if they were holding their breaths, unwilling to let out the fear, the uncertainty, the ache that had followed them from the moment they left home. The cave, for all its isolation, had a strange, almost oppressive presence. There was something in the air that felt ancient, as if it had been waiting for them, as if this was where they had always been meant to be. The ice beneath their feet cracked slightly, as if the very earth beneath them was unsettled, shifting in some unseen way. They were trapped here, not just by the storm, but by the sense of inevitability that seemed to pull them deeper into the cave's embrace. The ice walls, cold and lifeless, held a certain allure. They were beautiful in their own way, glittering untouched and smooth like a natural masterpiece. Yet they felt strangely alien, out of place in the world outside. The very nature of the cave seemed to separate them from everything they had known. It was as though, by stepping into its depths, they had left the world behind completely. For a long while, they simply sat there, side by side, the fire between them the only source of warmth. They needed to talk, needed to share the weight of their journey. But no words came. It wasn't that they were afraid of the storm outside or the unknown that lay beyond the cave. It was something deeper than that. Their escape, so carefully planned, had brought them here, but they had no real plan after this. What had they hoped for? What had they really expected? In the oppressive silence of the cave, the enormity of the situation settled over them. There was no way forward. There was no way out. All they had done was run, and now, in the face of the storm and the cave's endless walls, they realized they could run no longer. The wind outside howled like a living thing, but inside the cave, the atmosphere was unnervingly quiet. Even the fire crackled only faintly, its small flames casting an uneven light that flickered and threatened to go out at any moment. It was a stark reminder that this refuge, though seemingly safe, was temporary. The storm would not wait for them. It would not be merciful. The sisters had been running from the weight of their past, from the suffocating silence that filled their home, from the distance that had grown between their parents, from the chilling, unspoken fears that clung to them like shadows. But what had they truly expected when they left? Where had they thought they could escape by coming to this cave? Their minds were a swirl of questions, yet the answers were elusive, hiding just beyond their reach, like the dark edges of the shadows that stretched out on the walls. The only thing they knew for certain was that they were far from the safety they had imagined. There in the cold, surrounded by the stillness of the ice cave, the sisters began to unravel. The tension between them, which had been building for days, now surged to the surface. It was a tension neither of them could ignore. They had escaped the clutches of their past, but in doing so, they had brought their past with them. The isolation they sought had come with a price neither of them had anticipated. One of them spoke first, her voice soft, almost a whisper in the thick silence. "Do you think it was worth it?" The words hung in the air, fragile, as if they might break with the slightest touch. The question seemed simple, but it carried with it the weight of everything they had just done. Their decision to leave, their escape into the storm, their desperate search for something they could not name. The other sister looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and regret. She didn't answer immediately. How could she? There was no easy answer, no way to say what had driven them here, what they had been running from. "I don't know," she replied quietly. "I thought maybe if we left, it would be different. But nothing's changed. It still feels the same." The fire crackled weakly between them, as if to echo the dissonance that hung between their words. The storm outside, relentless and cruel, seemed to mock them as it raged on. They had sought out the wilderness in search of freedom, but the wilderness offered no such gift. Instead, it seemed to amplify the very fears and doubts they had hoped to escape. It was then that they noticed something strange. The ice walls, which had initially seemed so still and lifeless, were not as silent as they had believed. As they sat in the flickering light, something caught their eyes, a series of marks, faint and almost hidden, etched into the ice. The sisters leaned closer, their breaths coming more sharply now. There, in the smooth surface of the walls, were symbols, Strange, jagged lines, seemingly carved by something or someone long before them. The marks were unsettling. They were too deliberate, too precise to be random, yet they seemed to be lost in the folds of time. Had someone else come here before them? Someone who had, like them, sought shelter from a storm? Or was it something else, something darker, something that belonged to the cave itself? The symbols, although beautiful in their own way, felt wrong. They didn't belong in the calm of the cave. They belonged to something ancient, something that predated the sisters' understanding of the world. A chill ran down their spines as they traced the markings with their eyes. The deeper they looked, the more they felt an unease creeping into their bones. The symbols, cryptic and cold, began to feel like a warning, a message left by someone who had come here before, only to find themselves trapped by the same forces they sought to escape. The fear that had been simmering in the back of their minds now rose to the surface, as palpable as the cold that surrounded them. They were no longer just running from the storm. They were running from something older, something far more dangerous. The fire between them sputtered, casting long, twisted shadows against the cave walls. The symbols seemed to shift in the flickering light, dancing as if they were alive, as if they were waiting for the sisters to notice them, to acknowledge their existence. The sense of unease deepened as the sisters exchanged glances, their shared uncertainty now a quiet tremor between them. Was it possible that they had stumbled upon something far darker than they had ever imagined? Could the cave, their supposed refuge, hold secrets that even they were not meant to uncover? For the first time since their arrival, they felt trapped, not just by the storm, but by something much more insidious. The cave, once a symbol of escape, now seemed like a prison, its walls closing in around them as the storm outside raged ever harder. What had begun as a moment of respite now felt like a cruel illusion, a false hope that had only served to deepen the darkness within their hearts. And as they sat in the dim light of the fire, the weight of their past, of their family, their escape in the storm, pressed down on them with a new, unbearable force. They had come here to escape, but in the process, they had only found a deeper truth. There was no running from the things that haunted them, not the storm, not the past, not even the cave. The fire in the cave had begun to wane, its glow flickering weakly against the growing darkness, but the sisters barely noticed. The storm outside continued to scream its fury, howling against the rocks with an intensity that felt personal, as if the very world was angry at them for their attempt to escape. The warmth from the fire, which had once seemed like a gift, now felt small and fragile, offering little comfort against the cold weight of the cave and the unsettling truth that had begun to settle between them. Their gaze remained fixed on the markings etched into walls, the strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The symbols, jagged and ancient, were so unlike anything they'd ever seen that it felt impossible to ignore them. They had thought they were alone here, isolated in this cave, lost in the storm. But now, with every passing moment, they felt as though they were intruders in some forgotten world, trespassers in a place that had long since been abandoned by human hands. The symbols, carved into the ice as if by some unseen force, had become an oppressive presence in the cave. The flickering light of the fire cast their shadows on the walls, stretching and twisting like living creatures, moving in sync with the breeze that whispered through the cracks in the stone. Neither sister spoke for a long time. They simply sat, both lost in their own thoughts, their minds reeling from the surreal nature of what they had discovered. The markings were no accident. They were deliberate, ancient, and imbued with an energy that seemed both familiar and foreign. The longer they stared at them, the more it felt as if the symbols were watching them back, their presence inescapable, like an invisible force pressing down on the sisters' chests. It was as though the cave had become a mirror to their own internal struggle, reflecting the fear and uncertainty that had grown between them ever since they had stepped into the storm. The stillness in the cave was profound, a deep, oppressive quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a kind of silence that made everything feel too loud. Their own breathing sounded almost unnatural. The sound of their hearts beating in the heavy silence felt too strong, too rhythmic, like the distant thud of an approaching storm. The wind outside was louder than their thoughts, and yet, somehow, it was still not loud enough to drown out the growing sense of dread in their chests. The storm, once something they had welcomed as an escape, now felt like an endless chase. It had driven them from the house, away from their parents, from their lives. And yet, here they were in this cave, not free, but bound in another way, by something deeper. The feeling of being trapped was suffocating. It wasn't just the walls of the cave that confined them. It was something much older, something that had always been with them, something that had followed them all the way here, despite their best efforts to outrun it. As they sat there, the weight of their past began to rise to the surface. They had never spoken much about what had really driven them to leave. Their escape had been swift, a quick decision made in the heat of a moment that had felt like their last chance. The silence in the house had become unbearable. The broken fragments of their parents' love and bitterness had poisoned every conversation. There had been nothing left for them there, nothing but the sound of their mother's tired voice and their father's cold distance. They had been invisible in their own home, pushed aside in favor of something they couldn't understand. The sisters had believed that leaving, that running, was the answer. It was the only answer they could think of. They had run toward the mountains, toward the storm, toward the unknown. But what had they truly been running from? The more they thought about it, the more it became clear that it was not just their parents, not just their fractured family. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, something that neither of them had been ready to confront. The truth was, they had been running from themselves. It was in the stillness of the cave, as they sat there, huddled close to the fire, that the realization began to settle in. There had been no clean break, no real escape. The storm, the mountains, the cave, they had all been part of a bigger story, one that had been unfolding since the very moment they had been born. Their family had been torn apart by a slow, steady unraveling, and they had been helpless to stop it. Their escape was not just from the house, but from the hurt, the confusion, the helplessness that they had carried with them for so long. They had believed that running would free them. But now, as they sat in the darkness of the cave, they saw it clearly. There was no running from the things that haunted them. The fear, the pain, the loneliness. Those things had followed them. They had never truly left. The storm outside had only served to expose what had been hidden inside them all along. The quiet in the cave was thick with this realization, and yet there was still something else pressing at the edges of their consciousness, something that neither of them could yet face. The symbols on the walls seemed to mock them, their sharp, angular lines twisting into shapes that made no sense but felt hauntingly familiar. The more they stared at them, the more they felt that they were not just staring at random carvings, but at a kind of message, something that had been left for them, specifically for them, to understand. "Do you think we were meant to find this?" the first sister whispered. Her voice was low, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly would break the spell the cave seemed to have cast over them. Her sister, who had been staring intently at the markings for what felt like hours, finally broke her gaze. She blinked as if waking from a dream, her eyes wide, filled with the same fear that had gripped her when they had first entered the cave. "I don't know," she replied, her voice hoarse. "But it feels like we were." The silence between them deepened. Each sister, now feeling the weight of the cave's secrets pressing in on them. The markings on the walls were not just a discovery. They were a warning, a sign that they had crossed into a space they had never meant to enter. The cave was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was something more, a place of reckoning, a place where their past and future collided in ways they were not prepared for. As they sat there, trapped between the forces of nature and the forces of their own fear, they began to realize that the storm outside wasn't just a metaphor. It was real. The storm had followed them here, yes, but it was only the surface of something much deeper. The storm they were truly running from had always been inside them, growing, intensifying, until it became something they couldn't outrun. It had been the silence in their home, the quiet desperation in their mother's eyes, the cold indifference in their father's stare. It had been there all along, and now it was here in the cave, manifesting in the markings on the walls, in the isolation of the storm, in the oppressive weight of the night. It was then that they heard it, faint at first, like the echo of something far away, but growing louder with each passing second. The wind outside had picked up, howling even louder than before, but this sound was different. It was not the sound of nature, but something more deliberate, something that cut to the air with an unnatural edge. It was as if the storm outside was calling to them, beckoning them back into its fury. The howls seemed to reverberate in the cave, vibrating through the walls and into their very bones. And in that moment, they knew they could not stay here. The fear that had been creeping inside them now flared into panic. The cave, once a refuge, now felt like a prison, the storm outside pressing them closer to the walls. They had thought they were safe, but now it seemed like the storm had followed them into the cave, its very presence woven into the air itself. The symbols on the walls, which had once seemed like a message, now felt like a curse, an omen that they could never outrun what had followed them. With their hearts racing, the sisters rose to their feet. Their minds were a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them coherent. They had come here to escape, but they were only deeper in the grip of something they could not understand. The storm outside, the markings inside, the silence that had followed them, nothing made sense. It was as if they were trapped in a world that refused to follow the rules they understood. And in that moment, they realized that there was no escape, not from the storm, not from the cave, and not for what had been haunting them all along. The sisters stumbled backward, their movements jagged and frantic, as though the very air around them had shifted. The walls of the cave, once so inviting in their cold serenity, now seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching longer and more menacing as the storm outside raged with ever-growing intensity. It was as if the cave itself had become a living, breathing thing, its icy walls pulsating with some hidden, malevolent force that neither of them could explain. The silence between them was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the violent gusts of wind that battered against the cave's narrow entrance. The howl of the wind outside had changed, too. No longer was it simply a ferocious roar of nature. Now it had taken on a guttural, almost sorrowful tone, like a mournful cry that echoed across the mountains. It was as if the storm itself had grown aware of them, its fury focused, its intent clear. The sisters couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just survivors of a blizzard, but something far more entangled in the web of nature's ancient laws. They had thought they had escaped their past, their fears, their families unraveling. But in that moment, they understood they hadn't run far enough. Or perhaps they had run right into something they were never meant to confront. The marks on the cave walls seemed to come alive in the dim light, the jagged symbols twisting and writhing as if they were part of the very stone itself, their meaning elusive but undeniable. They had seen these markings before, in their nightmares, in fleeting moments when the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. But now, in the cold light of the fire, they felt as though they were staring into something far older, far deeper than anything they had ever encountered. The cave was no longer just a shelter. It had become an arena, a place where their past, their present, and their fears all converged. The marks on the wall were not just ancient carvings. They were the imprints of something that had once walked these lands, something that had been here long before the sisters ever set foot on these mountains. The realization hit them with a brutal force. They were not alone in the cave. They had never been alone. The air inside the cave grew heavier, colder, pressing on them from all sides. The fire between them flickered weakly, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls like fingers reaching toward them, trying to grasp them in their icy hold. The warmth they had hoped to find in the shelter of the cave had turned to an unsettling chill, as if the cave itself were expelling them. Every breath they took seemed more labored, and the suffocating sense of dread that had settled in their hearts began to claw at their minds. The storm outside may have been merciless, but the storm inside their hearts, inside the cave, was far more dangerous. The sisters exchanged looks, their eyes wide with the same fear, the same unspoken question. What had they gotten themselves into? There was no way out now. The cave had closed them in. The storm had blocked their escape, and the symbols on the walls had trapped them in some ancient force far beyond their comprehension. It was no longer a matter of running from their parents, or from the pain that had followed them from home. They were now running from something else, something primal and ancient, something they had no words for. As they stood there in the flickering firelight, the deeper realization began to set in. They were not just running from their family's fractured love. They were running from the unspoken things that lay beneath the surface of their own beings, the things they hadn't wanted to face, the deep fear of never being good enough, the crushing sense of abandonment, the darkness that had festered in their hearts and minds for so long that they had buried it, thinking they could leave it behind. But the storm, both the one outside and the one inside them, had followed them here, and now it seemed to be growing stronger, more insistent. One of the sisters, her hand trembling, reached out to touch the wall, her fingers brushing against the symbols. The stone was cold, smooth, yet it seemed to hum beneath her fingertips, as if it were alive with a hidden energy, an ancient force that pulsed with each heartbeat. Her heart raced in her chest as she traced one of the lines, the sharp angles of the markings almost painful to touch. It was then that she felt it, the shift in the air, the deep, unsettling sensation that something was watching them. Not the storm, not the wind, but something much more ancient, something tied to the very land itself. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled her hand away, stepping back in a rush. The other sister looked at her, eyes wide, as if she, too, had felt the invisible weight pressing down on them. "I don't think we should be here," the first sister whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. Her words felt too small, too fragile against the enormity of the fear they were facing. But her sister said nothing. Instead, she slowly turned her head, as though drawn to the farthest corner of the cave. There, hidden in the shadows, was something else, something they hadn't noticed before. It was a narrow opening in the stone, partially concealed by a thick layer of ice and snow. The darkness inside it seemed to stretch deep in the cave itself, an unknown abyss that beckoned them, not with promises of safety, but with the kind of pull that only the deepest, most terrifying places could exert. The moment they noticed it, the atmosphere in the cave changed again, the temperature dropping even further, the air turning heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. The wind howled outside, but it was no longer the wind that filled their ears. It was a faint, distant sound, a whisper. At first, they thought it was just the wind howling through the mountain pass. But then it came again, clearer this time, like a voice, a faint murmur, barely audible over the storm. It was a sound that seemed to echo within the very stone, reverberating in their chests like a heartbeat. "Did you hear that?" the first sister asked, her voice shaking. Her sister nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming from inside the cave," she said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. For a moment, neither of them moved. They stood frozen, listening to the sound, trying to make sense of it. But the more they listened, the more the whisper seemed to grow, until it was no longer just a voice. It became a presence, an awareness that filled the cave, suffusing the air with a cold, oppressive energy. The sisters could feel it now, pressing it on them from all sides. It was a kind of sensation that made their skin crawl, that made their hearts race and their minds spiral into panic. It was as if the cave itself was alive, as if the very walls, the very stones they had once seen as mere shelter, had taken on a will of their own. "I think we need to leave," the first sister whispered urgently, her voice barely audible against the mounting pressure. But her sister didn't move. Instead, she was drawn to the opening in the stone, the darkness that beckoned them. She could feel it now, too, the pull of something deeper, something ancient that was beyond their understanding. Her body trembled, but her feet took one slow, hesitant step forward, then another. "What are you doing?" the first sister cried, her voice rising in panic. "I have to see," the second sister replied, her voice distant, almost hypnotic. It was as though the very air around them had started to push against her will, forcing her to go forward, to move toward the darkness. "No!" the first sister gasped. She lunged forward, grabbing her sister's arm and pulling her back. But it was as if her sister was in a trance, her eyes glazed, her body moving despite the resistance. "Let go," the second sister murmured, her voice trembling. "I need to see. I need to know." The first sister's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her sister pull away from her grasp, her feet stepping closer to the dark opening. The wind outside howled louder, as if warning them, but it was no longer the wind they needed to fear. It was whatever lay hidden inside the cave, whatever ancient force had been awakened by their arrival. With trembling hands, the first sister reached out, grasping her sister's wrist tightly, pulling her back. The pressure was overwhelming, like an invisible force trying to push her forward. She pulled harder, her fingers digging into her sister's skin. "Don't," she begged, her voice raw with desperation. "We can't go in there. We don't know what's in there. We don't know what it wants." But her sister's eyes, wide, filled with fear, but also with something else, something darker, looked back at her. "We never escaped," she whispered. "We never will." In that moment, The first sister felt a shiver run down her spine, a coldness that pierced her very soul. The whispers, the pull of the cave, the storm outside, they were all part of the same thing. There was no running from it. There never had been. The moment the second sister's words hung in the air, the silence in the cave felt suffocating, the weight of them pressing down like an invisible hand around their throats. It wasn't just the fear in her voice that made the words feel so heavy. It was the truth that they carried. We never escaped. We never will. Her voice, trembling with the intensity of that revelation, pierced the air, and for a brief, fleeting moment, everything seemed to stop. The world outside, the storm, the biting wind, the cold, all of it ceased to exist. It was as though time itself had frozen, leaving the sister suspended in a moment that was both hauntingly still and terrifyingly alive. The first sister's heart raced in her chest as she stared at her sibling, her mind swirling with a mix of disbelief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of loss. She had always been the one to lead, to push them both forward, away from their past, away from the things that had haunted them for so long. She had been the one to think they could outrun everything that had gone wrong, the one to convince them that a new life, somewhere far away, could offer the freedom they so desperately craved. But now, as she stood there, gripping her sister's wrist, it all felt like an illusion. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't found the freedom they were searching for. All they had found was another prison, a different kind of cage, and this one, much like the last, was suffocating them in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Stop," the first sister whispered, her voice strained, barely audible over the rising wind outside. Her fingers tightened around her sister's wrist, as if holding on to her would somehow keep them both tethered to whatever fleeting sense of reality they had left. "We can't. This isn't real. We didn't come all this way just to be trapped again. We can't." But the second sister didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to grow even more still, her gaze fixed on the dark opening in the stone, the space where the shadows seemed to gather like a living thing. It was as though the cave itself had a pull on her, something beyond her control, something that she couldn't even recognize within herself. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a coldness that went straight to her soul. She was caught, trapped in the same web that had ensnared them from the very beginning, whether they had realized it or not. "I'm not running anymore," the second sister murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. "I don't think I ever was." Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she were seeing something beyond the darkness, something hidden in the shadows that only she could understand. "I don't think we were ever meant to escape." The words hit like a blow to the chest. It wasn't just a statement of despair. It was a realization that tore through everything the first sister had believed in. What had they been running from? What had they truly thought they could leave behind? The storm, the mountains, the cold, they were all external forces. But the truth, the real storm, had always been within them. It had always been inside their hearts, their minds, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And now, in this place, in this dark, ancient cave, it had come to the surface. The first sister shook her head, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and frozen earth. "No," she said, her voice more forceful now, though still trembling. "No, we can't be part of this. We've come too far. We can't let it, whatever it is, win." But her sister didn't respond. She didn't move. She was lost in whatever vision had overtaken her, her body standing motionless, as if she were a part of the cave itself, rooted in the earth, unwilling to leave. The fire between them flickered weakly, the flames casting a pale light on their faces. But it didn't seem to matter. The cold had crept into their bones, into their very souls, and no matter how hard they fought against it, it was growing stronger with every passing second. The second sister's eyes flicked back to the opening in the stone. "It's calling us," she said softly, her voice distant, as if the words were being pulled from her against her will. "It's been calling us all along. Can't you hear it?" The first sister felt a chill run through her as the words left her sister's lips. Could she hear it? That whisper, that soft murmur that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave, that distant voice that felt both familiar and alien at once. It had been there since they first stepped into the cave, a presence that lurked just beyond the edge of her awareness. It was a low hum, almost like the wind, but there was something different about it, something unsettling, something that felt alive. Her eyes darted to the dark opening her sister was so fixated on, but all she saw was shadow. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, and yet she could feel the pull, too. It was a strange thing, a magnetic force that seemed to emanate from a very stone, something ancient and powerful. It was as if the cave had been waiting for them, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, to show them the truth. "No," she said again, her voice trembling with urgency. "We can't. This is just a trick. This is just fear. We can't listen to it. We're stronger than this." But her sister's face was pale, her expression empty, as if she were no longer fully present. "I don't know," she whispered, her words heavy with something unspoken, something deep within her. "Maybe we are supposed to listen. Maybe we were never meant to escape. Maybe this is the end of the road for us." The first sister recoiled as if struck by the weight of those words. End of the road. The phrase echoed in her mind, reverberating off the walls of the cave, and for the first time she felt a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the very same helplessness that had driven them to leave in the first place. Could it be true? Had they been running from something they couldn't outrun? Were they doomed to repeat the same mistakes, over and over again, no matter how far they went? The storm, the mountains, the cave, perhaps they were all just manifestations of the same thing. A cycle that would never be broken. Her heart pounded in her chest, the raw, frantic beat loud in her ears. The cave seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer, enveloping them both in an ever-tightening grip. The wind outside, still howling like an angry beast, began to reverberate through the cave, making the walls tremble. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was something else, something beyond nature. The cave was alive with it, alive with the same ancient energy that had been calling to them, that had drawn them here in the first place. And then, as if on cue, the whispering grew louder. The distant murmur that had been just on the edge of hearing before was now unmistakable. The voices, no, not voices, something else. It was as if the cave itself was speaking, murmuring in an ancient tongue, words that felt both familiar and unknowable, like a memory half remembered, a language lost to time. The first sister took a step back, her feet slipping slightly in the icy stone beneath her. The air in the cave grew thicker, colder, pressing against her skin. "What is that?" she breathed, her voice cracking with fear. Her sister, standing motionless before the dark opening in the stone, didn't reply. Instead, she seemed to sway slightly, as if drawn forward by an unseen force. Her eyes were fixed on the shadowed space, her lips parting as though she were trying to speak, but no words came. The first sister's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening. Something was taking hold of her sister. The pull from the cave, from the darkness, was undeniable. And as much as she wanted to turn away, as much as she wanted to run back to the warmth of the fire and the fleeting sense of safety, she knew deep down that there was nowhere left to run. The cave, the storm, the whispering voices. They were all part of the same thing, a force that had been following them, pulling them in, tightening its grip around them until there was nothing left but the choice to face it. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, as she stepped forward and grabbed her sister's arm once again. "We can't let it take us. We're not meant to be here." But her sister, with her vacant stare and still, trembling body, gave no answer. She was already lost, drawn too deeply into darkness to be reached. And for the first time, the first sister understood. They weren't just trapped by the storm. They were trapped by something much older, something far darker. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The cave was no longer a place of refuge. What had once seemed like a shelter against a storm had transformed into something far more sinister, a suffocating, inescapable prison. The walls, once cold and reassuring, now pressed them with an unbearable weight, as though they were closing in around the sisters, squeezing them into a space far too small for what they had hoped to be. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the walls, twisting and shifting with every flicker of the dying fire, as if they were alive, waiting to pounce. The first sister stood frozen, her hand still gripping her sister's arm, trying to hold on some semblance of reality, but it was slipping away from her. Her sister, so close yet so unreachable, seemed to drift further and further from her, her gaze lost in the blackness of the cave, her body unervingly still. The whispering had grown louder, an unintelligible murmur that filled the cave, reverberating off the ice-coated walls like an ancient chant, a language lost to time. The very air around them seemed charged with this oppressive energy, the weight of it pressing against their skin, filling their lungs, making it difficult to breathe. For a moment, the first sister felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, as if the cave itself was alive, moving in rhythm with the wind outside. The storm raged on, but now it felt distant, as if it were no longer a part of the world they inhabited. The real storm was here in this space, inside the cave, and it was one of the mind. The fear, the uncertainty, the suffocating darkness. It was all part of the same twisted force that had drawn them in. There was no escape. The thought rang through her mind again and again, louder than the storm itself. "Please don't," the first sister whispered, her voice barely audible, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled harder on her sister's arm, trying to bring her back, but it was as though she was trying to hold on to a dream slipping away from her, something intangible, fading with each passing moment. Her sister didn't respond. She didn't move. She was trapped in a different world now, one that the first sister couldn't reach, no matter how desperately she tried. The space between them had grown, a chasm that could never be bridged, a gap filled with the weight of everything they had tried to escape but couldn't. The fire was nothing more than a smoldering pile of ash now, the embers flickering weakly, barely alive. The warmth it had once offered had long since faded, leaving only a bitter chill that sank deeper into their bones. The cave seemed to exhale a cold breath, and with it, an unbearable stillness settled around them. Time had slowed, stretched out in a way that felt endless, and yet the minutes, the seconds, continued to slip by unnoticed, consumed by the overwhelming pull of the cave, the relentless whispering, the shadows that moved just out of reach. The second sister's eyes, once filled with fear, now held something else. There was no recognition in them, no sign of the person she had once been. It was as though she had become part of the cave itself, her body drawn to the shadows, to the ancient force that had called to them from the moment they had entered. The pull was undeniable. The first sister could see it now, in her sister's vacant expression, in the slow, deliberate steps she took toward the opening in the stone, toward the darkness that beckoned them. The distance between them felt like an abyss, impossible to cross, no matter how hard she tried. "Stop," the first sister pleaded, her voice breaking as she staggered forward, but her legs felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath her was pulling her down. She couldn't keep up. She couldn't reach her sister. She had tried everything, begging, pleading, even reasoning, but none of it had worked. The more she tried to hold on to her, the further her sister seemed to slip away. The second sister's hand stretched toward the opening, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and in that moment, the first sister knew. She knew that whatever had taken hold of her sister had taken hold of her, too. The pull of the cave, of the darkness, had become too strong. They were both being drawn into it, and there was no way to stop it now. "No!" the first sister whispered again, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from the suffocating grip that had latched onto them. But she couldn't. She was trapped, just like her sister. They had both been caught in the same snare, woven by forces they couldn't comprehend, by something far older, far more powerful than anything they could have imagined. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The storm, the mountain, the cave, the symbols on the walls, the whispering voices. It had all been leading them here, to this moment. They hadn't come to escape. They hadn't come to find freedom. They had come to confront something they had always carried with them, something that had been waiting for them in the shadows. The cave had not been a refuge. It had been a trap, one set long before they ever arrived. And now, they were caught in its web, and there was no way out. For a long while, neither sister moved. The whispering had faded into the background, replaced by the harsh beating of their hearts, the only sound that seemed to matter in this place. The second sister stood before the dark opening, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, as though she were seeing something there, something she'd been waiting for, something only she could understand. Her face was pale, her expression vacant. But there was a strange calmness about her, a stillness that made the first sister's blood run cold. She was no longer just afraid. She had accepted it.